My name's Susan Hurahan. I'm one of the lead OTs here at the National Hospital, and we're really lucky tonight to have Alastair Smith come up from Plymouth University, where he is an associate professor and deputy head of the School of Psychology at the University of Plymouth. Alastair and I met at a conference for the MS Trust where we did a talk together on cognition, and I learnt so much from him at that exchange that I thought it would be really nice to have him here. In particular, in Plymouth, he's leading the laboratories in psychology and in brain research and imaging centre, also known as BRIC, which I love. And his work's focusing on cognitive and neural foundations of spatial abilities in humans, and he's published research on typical and atypical function using a variety of empirical methods. And he has published a book which is available on Amazon called Cognition in the Real World, and published by Oxford University Press. And and it's really nice to have you here, Alastair, to talk to us tonight. And it's a really interesting discussion on the role of drawing at tasks in neuropsychological assessment. So I'll hand over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks ever so much for inviting me. It's lovely to be here. So I am an academic through and through. I'm not a clinician. I do a lot of work with different patient groups now and again, and I work with people that have different developmental trajectories. But ultimately, I'm interested in designing experiments to understand how human information processing works, and in particular, spatial abilities, how we understand the world around us, how we negotiate things, how I managed to get here without looking at the map. So that clearly means I'm inspecting some kind of cognitive architecture that's representing my environment. So that's the kind of thing we spend a lot of our time doing. We're doing a lot of work with VR, for example, because it allows us to create very controlled environments that we can do lots of things with. But I thought, what might be the most appropriate thing to talk about with you lot? And so I thought I'd go back to my first love. And my first love here is drawing. This is something that I spent my PhD thinking about an awful lot. And I should imagine that a lot of you are very used to either asking people to do drawings of some way, shape or form, or certainly inspecting the odd drawing, even if all you're doing is applying a score to that thing. And so what I'd like to do today is kind of give you a little whistle-stop tour about the way that drawings can reflect different types of impairment to human cognition, in particular visuospatial cognition or perception. Then I'd like to suggest that we're not getting as much out of drawings as we could, and I'm going to give you a few examples of times where I and people that I've worked with have thought about redesigning drawing tasks, taking different metrics to try and give us some more nuanced insights. I'm scared that probably the first publication of mine I'm going to talk about is 20 years old now, but there is also some very recent data there that's only just been sent out to review, so at least it's not going to make me feel too old. But hopefully you'll just kind of get a sense of the kind of things one can do with drawing in an age of machines that go ping. And also, hopefully, it might give you an insight into the kind of things that you might not always be aware of. I think the beautiful thing about neuropsychology is that it shows you things that you otherwise wouldn't have necessarily considered. There are conditions where people see all faces as fish heads. You know, it's called metamorphopsia. The eyes are all bulgy. They just look like fish heads. That's the only visual disturbance. It only happens for faces. And, you know, unless you've seen an impairment like that, it wouldn't necessarily occur to you that that might happen, or that a quirk of processing would do that. So I think hopefully, at the very least, I can show you some interesting things can happen with drawings, and that tells you something that you might not necessarily know about a patient, or indeed about human cognition full stop. So, this is a good start. There we go. I'm going to presume that this is relatively familiar to some of you. Mm-hmm. So this is the mini mental state, and we're asking questions about where you currently are, what's currently going on, no ands, ifs or buts, all of that kind of thing. But one of the tasks within the mini-mental state is to copy those two overlapping pentagons. And that's done for a reason, because you can get a variety of errors. And those errors are not necessarily indicative of the fact that someone can't see the pentagons or someone's not very good at controlling their pen. We can see something that's a little more systematic, if you like, an error that is indicative of some difficulty somewhere in copying that image. So if these are the stimuli here, we can see that these are relatively good stabs. They're not perfect, but these are five-sided figures that are kind of overlapping in the right place. But all you need to do is look further down and we can see a number of things that are beginning to happen. Here's someone that's just drawing a variety of pentagons. Here we have two pentagons, but they've been nicely oriented and nicely put next to each other. This person is drawing pentagon after pentagon and overlapping each other. This is called closing in, where what you're drawing ends up sort of being superimposed onto the model. So hopefully we can all agree that this isn't just a collection of individuals that can't draw or don't know what they're supposed to be doing or can't see what they're supposed to be doing. Something more interesting is happening here. Presumably you're also familiar with this equivalent. If you can't do, actually one costs money now, doesn't it? Or does this one cost money too?
Yeah, just for the training.
Yeah, that's right. I've still got lots of photocopies. So in the mocker, there are two drawing tasks. One is a copying task, one is a drawing from memory task. So someone might be asked to copy that wireframe cube in the space here, and that's tapping similar things to the mini-mental state. Can you perceive? Can you do something intentional? Can you notice the errors you're making? Can you correct them? All of that kind of thing. But drawing a clock gives us more, doesn't it? Drawing a clock from memory requires you to access your stored knowledge of what a clock looks like, what it does, and then you have a figure that's got lots of parts that you need to get in the right place in order for it to be accurate. And then, of course, you've got to set the time to 11:10. And people love clocks, of course, because you get a whole variety of intriguing output sometimes, and that output represents difficulty with that process, and it might represent difficulty with different components of that process. It might be about knowing where the numbers go, it might be about having the right kind of numbers, it might be in controlling the drawing movements, but again, hopefully you can see that the errors you get are not necessarily indicative of someone not being good at drawing or not being able to see what they do. These are cognitive impairments that are revealing themselves. So, more broadly, drawing as an act might seem simple, but it requires an awful lot of thought. That's a stupid thing to say, of course it requires thought. It requires an awful lot of other processes in order for it to be accurately enacted, if you like. So even though it might seem very simple, even to make a mark on the page, there's a complex synthesis of cognitive functions that need to be orchestrated. So if you are copying something, you need to perceive the thing you're going to copy. You're also going to have to monitor your output whilst you're doing it. You know what it's like when you try drawing with your eyes closed. It goes all over the place, doesn't it? If you're being asked to draw from memory, as I've just alluded to, you need to access the thing that you're drawing. So that might be first a semantic access. Someone said a word, you have to decode the word, know that it refers to a concept, and then you're going to have to access your stored visual knowledge of that concept, and so on. And of course, you've got to plan movements and all those kind of things. So in some respects, a huge arc of cognitive abilities are being required in order to do these rather simple things. As such, it is a useful tool to assess different types of function after damage. Also, it is cheap and it is easy to administer. And you know, if everything's becoming under the purview of a publisher, you can still get a bit of A4 and a biro and ask someone to quickly draw something. And the point I want to hammer home, partly because I'm a scientist and I kind of ruin things by making them dry and detailed rather than preserving their magic, but you can study drawing in a manner that is separate to creativity, that is separate to training, that is separate to art. You can actually look at it as a sort of human communicative skill, or indeed a visuomotor act. And you can study it scientifically, you can get numbers out of it. And that's kind of what I'm going to try and show today, that you can get more than a basic score on the basis of how silly the hands are on a clock, for example. So, what I'm going to do for the first half of this talk is just try and give you some examples of how drawing can systematically, or drawing errors, I should say, systematically reveal aspects of impairment in some different patient groups. To give you a sense of where that's going to come from, this is a computer scientist's model of human information processing, by which I mean, I'm justifying it because it's not what most psychologists would adhere to. It's very serial, but in effect what it's saying is there's stuff in the world and you perceive that stuff with your sensory apparatus, you do things to that stuff, you process that information, and then there's some kind of output. We do. The reason why I'm being somewhat protective, if you like, of my subject is a lot of these things don't just work in that serial fashion. Everything's all beautifully recursive. What you perceive is dependent probably on what you're doing and so on. But for the purposes of illustration, you can imagine that impairments to different parts of this process might produce different types of output in someone's drawing. So, to give you some quick examples of that, if you imagine the sensory system or the perceptual system has somehow been impaired, you might see that someone will have distinct difficulty copying something because they cannot accurately perceive it. So this is patient DF. DF had visual form agnosia, so this is V1 damage after carbon monoxide poisoning. She's not blind. You can do all the perimetry and she knows where all the lights are, all of that kind of thing. But she can't form a stable percept. She can't put any of the pieces in the world together to form a sort of global, coherent whole. So if you show her this thing that she's being asked to copy, that is what she will do. And she can't tell you what the thing was. She can't tell you whether a copy is any good or not. So you can imagine that being an impairment to being able to accurately perceive what you've been asked to copy. This is a patient with a visual memory deficit. So this patient has been asked to draw a giraffe, and this is what they draw. Now, this patient was very good at drawing artifacts, so bed frames, screws, things like that. But he had distinct difficulty with living things. And you can imagine why to a certain degree. Most living things are all kind of bodies and legs and necks and heads and bottoms, but just all kind of extruded out with different proportions, aren't they? There's not an awful lot of difference between a horse and a cow. It's all about the relative lengths, the distances between things. And so this patient is unable to access stored visual knowledge for living things. So that patient could tell you what a giraffe is, where a giraffe lives, what a giraffe does, but can't actually give you the visual form of a giraffe. And then finally, if you have an impairment to the system that allows you to accurately produce movements or plan actions, plan your drawing, then you can see that there are going to be errors that are basically about the quality of the output. In this case, the human motor system really doesn't like oblique lines compared to horizontal or vertical lines. It's just harder to do a diagonal line. And so what you see in some cases is a lot of oversimplification of what a patient has been asked to draw. They can see perfectly well what it is, but they just can't plan the actions. And they'll tell you afterwards that that was terrible. They understand that it's not right, but in actually planning and enacting the movements, there are difficulties. And again, it's a cognitive concern. They have no difficulties making movements. It's very specifically about movements to reproduce something. So what I'm going to do now is give you a slightly more in-depth view of some of those impairments, some of these sorts of impairments to visuospatial thinking, and show you how they can affect drawing production in different ways, and also, on occasion, how people have used those impairments to tell us more about the condition. So visual agnosia is a selective deficit in recognizing objects from vision. So again, patients are not blind, and they have intact semantic knowledge, but in terms of actually understanding what something is when it is presented to them, they are not able to access that information. And classically, there are two forms of agnosia. There's apperceptive agnosia, which is in effect a failure to form a stable percept. So like DF before, in effect you can't cohere all of these edges together to make that object. Okay? So you're being presented with some kind of stimulus, but you can't form anything coherent out of that in order to then access what something is. In contrast, someone with what was called associative agnosia can form a stable percept of a thing, they just cannot use that thing to access their knowledge of what this thing is. So again, someone will know what a watch is, but if you show them this thing, they cannot access that information. And so drawing traditionally was a really helpful way of distinguishing between different types of agnosia. So an associative agnosia will be able to copy something, they just cannot tell you what they've copied. So DF was the example I gave you quickly earlier of someone with visual form agnosia, which is in effect apperceptive agnosia, so difficulty forming that percept of the world. So if you ask her to copy these things, we probably all know these to be apples and books. I guess these are Snodgrass figures. Her copies are very poor, but if you ask her to draw an apple from memory or to draw a book from memory, she can do okay. Again, you have to remember that she's not able to form a percept of anything around her. She can't recognize what she's drawn if you show it to her a bit later on. But they're okay. But other forms of agnosia have really relied on drawing to become more known to us scientifically, if you like. So this is someone called HJA. When I was an undergraduate, I did my final year project with HJA. HJA had what was called integrative agnosia. And to all intents and purposes, it looked like he had apperceptive agnosia. But if you asked him to copy something, he did a really good job. So here's the eagle, and here's HJA's drawing. If he was asked to draw an eagle from memory, that's what he drew. And this is what an age-matched control drew. But again, this is someone with a profound perceptual impairment. He also was achromatopsic, so the world was black and white. He couldn't piece anything together, and yet these things were indicative of something. But what differed here was that this copy took about half an hour for him to produce. It was very slavishly, line by line. It was produced very slavishly in a line-by-line fashion. So, in effect, it was the drawing production that told you something more about HJA here. Is the fact that it was so laborious, and the fact that he was doing it part by part gave you an insight into the fact that he was able to perceive slightly smaller chunks of the world and then had to sort of laboriously stick those things together. The nice thing about HJA, so my undergraduate degree was from the University of Birmingham, and so Glyn Humphreys and Jane Riddock were there for a very long time, and they were initially at Birkbeck, where they'd identified this patient. And HJA every summer would come to Birmingham and just get lambasted, like tasks left, right and centre from everyone interested in any aspect of object recognition and what have you. But that means that you've got a patient that you can get very interesting longitudinal data from. And his drawings were a really helpful component of that. So his stroke, he had a bilateral occipitotemporal stroke, so one there and then one not very long afterwards. This is 4 years after his stroke, or strokes. This was when he was asked to draw a leak from memory, and this is where he was asked to draw an owl from memory. But 10 years after that point, when he was asked to draw a leak from memory and an owl from memory, this is what he produced. And what this was helpful to show was that his visual knowledge was beginning to degrade over time. So, at this point, if you asked him to describe the visual properties of a leek and an owl, he'd give you these beautifully florid textbook descriptions. They're a real joy to read. But if you asked him at this point to give the same visual descriptions of things, they were much less detailed. There's a real paucity of the defining qualities of that vegetable or that bird and what have you. And so the argument was that we need everyday perception to kind of maintain and calibrate and update our visual memories for things in the world. And if you don't have access to that, if your perceptual system no longer lets that calibrating information in, that stuff begins to degrade over time. You've got nothing to keep it alive, as it were. So his copying skills were unaffected, but his drawing from memory was getting worse and worse, and that reflected that change over time. Another aspect of drawings that can give you insights that you might not expect are the basic orientation. Are any of you familiar with the Ray figure or the Turner figure? Taylor figure, not Turner. So these are complex figures that you can ask people to copy in order just to see how accurately they perform their copy. You can also ask them to reproduce it from memory at different points. And so not only do you just get a sense of the accuracy of what they're doing and the quality of that memory over time, but also you can look at how it was produced. So you can sort of degrade the way the drawing was, the order in which the drawing was produced to get aspects of it. So most typical people would start with a rectangle here and then subdivide it into parts. So you treat these things hierarchically. Solms and colleagues took a raft of Ray figures and Taylor figures from some patients on a neurological ward and found that a subset of those patients spontaneously rotated their copies. So these are copies of what they're drawing, so it's drawn directly beneath this. But all of these patients rotated them, and on the whole, they rotated them 90 degrees anti-clockwise. They didn't know they had done that. It was a copy. What happened after the fact was that when they were then later tested for different components of their object recognition abilities, it transpired that these patients were unable to accurately distinguish or the orientation of objects at different angles. So, in effect, rotated drawings begin to give you a sense that someone has an impairment in being able to encode the orientation that something is in the world. They can recognize it, they just can't discriminate between two differently oriented things. And the reason why they appear to have been rotated 90 degrees anti-clockwise is perhaps because they've all been rotated onto what you might consider the most stable base of the thing. They've all gone for a kind of house-like orientation, haven't they? Hemispatial neglect is something that drawing's been classically used to illustrate because it's a very compelling way of looking into a condition, if you like, in a way that you may not otherwise be able to immediately spot. So in neglect, this usually follows right hemisphere temporoparietal damage. Patients tend to fail to detect or respond to or explore the left-hand side of space, so the contralesional side of space. And you get a whole host of sort of behavioural ramifications for this. So people might shave one half of their face, eat one half of their dinner, and then you sort of turn the plate round 180 degrees and they've got a whole new dinner to eat. They might not be able to detect the difference between these two houses, for example. But drawing is a really nice way in there, and any sort of textbook you look at will always have these kind of images in here, where people who are copying stimuli will miss out details from the left-hand side of that stimulus. So we've got missing numbers from this clock, missing left half of this house, missing left half of this cat, no awareness that that cat has two tails. So that gives you an insight into the fact that their perceptual or their attentional abilities are compromised and they're sort of lateralized. But you can also see in patients that do not have overt inattention to their sort of immediate perceptual surroundings might still demonstrate it for imaginal surroundings. So this patient did not have inattention of the real world, but when asked to draw things, would systematically leave off the left-hand side of imaginal space. And you can also use drawings to find interesting components of neglect that, again, you might not otherwise spot. And that is that it's not always the left-hand side of the world that is neglected, but sometimes the left-hand side of objects, irrespective of where they appear in the visual field. So drawings were a really helpful way into beginning to discover that. So using these odd phallic buildings as an example, you can see that the left-hand side of this building is missing, but if you rotate that building a little, so some of it's now in the right visual field, it's still the left-hand side of the object that has been neglected. So you can have space-based neglect, but you can also have object-based neglect as well. And finally, constructional abilities are something that can be affected in a way that is completely independent of perception or any aspect of memory or language or what have you, and also any aspect of action. Constructional apraxia is a specific disorder of being able to reproduce spatial relationships. And that needn't be in drawings alone. Sometimes it's called a drawing-specific impairment. But actually, if you gave someone Lego pieces to reproduce something, or you asked them to do a block design task, they'll have an awful lot of difficulty. And that's in reproducing the relationships between items in the world that they've been presented with. They don't have a movement deficit, they don't have a perceptual deficit, but in terms of just planning those movements required to reproduce what they can see, they have an awful lot of difficulty. So here's an example of someone copying a house, and you can see that not all of the parts are quite where they should be, and so on. And traditionally, you had different types of constructional apraxia, and that was dependent upon whether you had left hemisphere or right hemisphere damage. But in the 80s, it began to be apparent that the manner in which the drawings were scored was important here. And if the person scoring the drawings was blind to where the patient's damage was, then lo and behold, these differences seem to go away. And so what that begins to tell us is that one's expectation of a drawing error that might be on the basis of what you know about the patient's damage, or what you might expect to see from that type of damage, or what if you're someone like me who's hoping to publish something really interesting with some really nice drawings, you're almost crossing your fingers that someone's going to do something intriguing. But clearly, if we take all of that human expectation out of the way, all of those biases out of the way, then some of these important distinctions upon which theories were built seem to disappear. So that tells us something, that not only are drawings fascinating from time to time, give us these insights from time to time, but also if we're not careful, we're going to read more into them, we're going to start building theories about human cognition, indeed, that are perhaps not necessarily appropriate. So that's where I'm going with this, that there are problems in the ways in which we use drawings. I'm not the first person to say this, but unlike loads of other skills, especially thinking about the company I'm currently in, we know a lot about reading, we know a lot about language, we know a lot about movement, we know a lot about all of these things. And so when we're interested in understanding patient impairment, we have this kind of ready-made context within which to put it. And that will inform treatment as much as it will inform understanding. But we don't have that with drawing. Drawing is somehow considered a window into other things and not a thing in its own right. And so our understanding of what someone appears to have done and how well they appear to have done it and what that might mean is not related back to what we know about drawing. And in truth, that's partly because we don't know an awful lot about drawing. But it seems, for something that's so ubiquitous, it seems very odd that we're not making more of it. Drawing tests are usually analysed by qualitative means. So even if you're applying a score, Even if you've administered the mocha and you've got a score of 3, haven't you, for the circular contour, the placement of the numbers and the hands. All of the analyses you've made are still ultimately very qualitative. Well, I think those hands are probably a bit different, aren't they? You don't really measure them. On occasion you do if you're really forced, but you're making qualitative assessments. More often than not, we're making assessments of people's performance on the basis of what we assume they were previously able to do, what a typical person should do. So we assume that someone had a baseline that is now somehow different. And as I've already alluded to, these things are open to contamination from expectation. We know a patient has a certain type of damage, or we know they're in a certain type of group, and therefore we would expect behaviour to be in a certain way. And it doesn't always work like that, does it? When I was a PhD student, I'd gone to the neurology ward, and I was allowed to look through notes and look for interesting patients that might be helpful. And so after a while, you find someone that's got the damage in all the interesting areas. Oh, this is going to be great, I'm sure. They might have constructional apraxia. And it transpires that they don't have this one-to-one correspondence between damage and behaviour. It doesn't work like that. And there was a period where one of my colleagues was testing someone as a neglect patient for her study, and I was testing the same patient as someone without neglect, but with constructional apraxia. So we both had a different badge for that patient. And the very fact that for her he had neglect and that was important, and for me he didn't have neglect and that was really important, it's just bonkers. But we just bring all this stuff with us. So my thesis here is that neuropsychological diagnosis, or whatever you in this room might want to take from a drawing, can be improved if we treat these things more seriously, if we try and get more nuance out of these things. If we know more about how drawings are produced, that might help us. And if we try and impose some kind of system on the way we think about these things, perhaps a quantitative system, perhaps make things dry and long-winded, which I want to do, then that will tell us more than we might otherwise know. So we do know stuff about drawing. It kind of came and went in an interesting way in the history of, certainly in the history of psychology. But if you think about it, it can be quite a boggling problem. So if you're copying something, let alone drawing something from memory, there are countless ways you can imagine that drawing being produced. And the more complex the figure, the greater the array of movements and actions and strategies someone might take when producing a drawing. So it looks like a problem, and it looks like you'd never necessarily be able to begin to find some basic systematicity in there. However, there is. We all draw in a very stereotyped way. We only use a relatively limited repertoire of movements and building blocks of drawing, if you like. And it's very strong. It's been called the grammar of action. So I'm going to give you some examples, just a couple, to give you a sense of what I mean by this. And those came from this chap, Peter Van Summers. When I was putting these slides together, I suddenly had a sense that I wonder if Peter Van Summers is dead. I don't mean I think about that every time I cite a person, but I thought it suddenly occurred to me that he was born in 1930, and that was a long time ago. And I realised I couldn't find anything out about this man's life course. So he had this really interesting impact on psychology that not very many people are aware of. So he was teaching art and design, I think in Sydney or Melbourne, and then got a few travel grants, went to the States for a bit, came to the UK for a bit, got really interested in psychology and started running these really interesting studies, painstaking studies, videotaping people, drawing and copying lots of very simple figures, and sort of sifting all of that for the systematicity, seeing what people did. So this book here, Drawing and Cognition, this is kind of, again, quite dry, dismantling of something beautiful, but in and of itself, that's a beautiful thing. It's got a really interesting way of adding system to something that you may not have otherwise noticed. And so some of the things he was able to characterize, if you like, what we can call production rules. So these are biases that determine, as a mechanical agent with arms and such like, what you're going to do. And those things are where you're likely to start, the direction that you're likely to move in, whether or not you're going to take the stylus from the surface that you're using. So we can consider these things the kind of basic units of drawing, just in the same way that you might perform any other action with a little repertoire of things. If you play the guitar, you've got your different chords or something like that. It's kind of the same principle. We've got these basic units here. And these things develop, as I said, as a result of us being sort of mechanical agents, if you like. We have bodies, and we have bodies that prefer to move in certain ways. If you put your right arm out with the palm facing up, would you like to put your right arm out with your palm facing up? So if you try and turn that thing 90 degrees anti-clockwise, that feels perfectly good, doesn't it? If you try and turn it 90 degrees anti-clockwise, that's not very nice. My body wasn't designed to do that. And it's the same principle. When we're drawing, we exploit the mechanical constraints of our bodies. And naturally, we try and do these things in a way that don't use up as much energy as they otherwise might. So we're trying to conserve energy, maximize freedom, maximize control, all of those kind of things. So I'm going to give you two quick examples of that. I'm already very aware that I've got too much of this talk, so I'm going to have to do a bit of zipping. So if we think about starting position, so Van Summers gave lots of people lots of right-angled triangles to copy, lots. And in this figure, he's overlaid all of those triangles on top of each other and has shown you the total number of 24 participants that started their copy of that triangle at this vertex. What this tells us is that everybody started drawing that triangle there. Everybody started drawing that triangle there. Everybody started drawing that triangle here. Everyone did that one here. Everyone did that one here. So basically, all right-handed people will start at the closest point to 11 o'clock. And the triangles where 11 o'clock's around here, so you've got this kind of oblique that's in the way, if you like, will kind of distribute their preference either to this one or to this one. Left-handers do show a strong bias. It's not a mirror. It tends to be closer to 12 o'clock. These things do interact with writing systems, and you can see in pre-literate children that they tend to start at the bottom right and will eventually migrate up to the top left. But it's something that maximizes the movement potential of your arm. You have to, do any of you do calligraphy by any chance? You have to think about your arm a bit like doing calligraphy. In calligraphy, you never push up against the nib. You kind of pull across and you pull down. And it's the same with the arm. You get the most freedom of movement if you start up there and then can go down in all of these directions. Threading is another one of these rules. Threading refers to making any change in direction with your stylus without taking it off of the page. Because if you take it off, more often than not, you need to put it back again. And that comes with a demand. You have to put it back in the place you want it to be. So to keep it on the page is to delete one of the problematic things you might have to do when you're performing a drawing. So attributes of what you're drawing will either promote or discourage the likelihood that you're going to take your pen off the page. So you can do this on your palm with your finger if you want. If you're drawing a little square, you're most likely to draw that in one continuous movement and not take your pen off the page or your fingertip off your palm. But if you draw something large, you're much more likely to take your pen off the page, reposition to somewhere that's more comfortable, where you have more control, and then draw. Take it off, reposition to somewhere where you've got more control, and so on. So the likelihood of someone taking their pen on or off the page is a product of what they're drawing. And the same goes for angular transitions. An acute angle is more likely to be associated with a pen lift because it's a greater change in direction. If it's more obtuse, you've got less change. If it's more acute, you're probably going to have to come off, reposition, and carry on. Okay. So there are some things we might use there. There are some things we might expect to see, not in necessarily the output, but actually in the manner in which a drawing was produced. And that's before we even think about actually getting real numbers out of someone's drawing, asking them to copy something very specific as accurately as they can, and they're measuring what they've done. So, as I said, drawings are generally analysed qualitatively, and people don't care about how they were done. They tend to just look at the final piece. There are nice things about, at least about the ray figure. You can give people different coloured pens, can't you, and look at how the thing emerged over time, but that's very rare. So, there are gains, I would contend, from studying how someone produced something, because that's quantitative, that's a thing, it's well modelled. We know that people tend to do things in a certain way, and we now have an index that we might be able to play with. But also, if we analyse things more closely, more carefully, we might be able to divine things that we otherwise wouldn't know. So, I'm going to very quickly, because I realise I have been talking too much in the wrong bits, give you some examples of this in action. And so these are going to be examples from my research career. And as I alluded to earlier, what's going to make me really sad is probably the first one is, or the second is 20 years old now, and it's just making me feel odd. But I'm going to give you 4 examples. I'm going to show you that if you analyse drawing production as well as the finished outcome, you get something interesting. I'm going to show you that if you have a more sensitive eye to the way you design your drawing tasks and the way you analyse them, you can tell something about patients that you otherwise wouldn't know, patients that would otherwise be lumped together in one category. I'm going to show how you can apply these things to other domains. So I'm going to take it out of neuropsychology and put it into autism research and show how you can use some of these things to compare competing theories. And then finally, I'm going to give you a quick vignette that shows that it's very important for us to constantly appraise what we think typicality is, normality, whatever you want to call it. We make assumptions about baseline performance, what people should be able to do, and we need to be careful about that, certainly in the future. So, number 1. The clock drawing test, as you know, is exceedingly well used. And it's been exceedingly well used in neglect for the same reason that it's well used in a lot of other domains, because the placement of all those parts, all of those numbers, tells you something about a person's visuospatial attention. So it's widely used. It forms part of what's still probably the gold standard of understanding neglect and inattention. And there are 2 common errors you get for neglect patients when they are drawing a clock from memory. So this is the kind of thing you're likely to see in a textbook. There are numbers missing from the left-hand side. You get alternative kind of errors too. This is called alacriria, and this is where the numbers are all present, but they've all been located to the right-hand side of the figure. If any of you have ever delved into the murky world of clock drawing, there are loads of different scoring mechanisms for this. And all of them primarily concentrate on the placement of the numbers, because there's lots of numbers. That's the interesting part. You've got all of this difficulty trying to get the right number, get it in the right place, and so on. But there's very little attention paid to the circle, the contour. That's the first thing that people draw. And yet the assumption is that's absolutely fine. So Halligan and Marshall, who are the kind of doyens of neglect, that sounds like a terrible thing to call someone, you're the doyen of neglect. They said in this book, which is a big book in neglect, one feature of clock drawing that's rarely been mentioned is that the circumference of the clock face is not usually affected. Perhaps the optimal gestalt of the circle precludes the omission of the parts thereof, which is a long-winded way of saying circles are simple, it's one quick movement, it doesn't have parts, it's just a thing. It's always fine. But, you know, there's an argument that that's a qualitative appraisal. So, here's a collection of right hemisphere patients. On the basis of their behavioural inattention test score, which if it is below a cutoff of 129, I think, or at or below 129 means they have neglect. So these patients have neglect. And what I asked these poor people to do is just draw lots and lots and lots of circles. So circles of different sizes on a bit of A4, and then underneath the blank space, and you're copying that circle as accurately as you can. And then there's a little mark put posthumously, post hoc, on the circle that shows you where they started and the direction that they went in case one is interested. And then a lot of time can be spent with a ruler looking just at basic size error. So the difference between the maximum height of what they drew and the height of the circle, the maximum width of what they drew and the circle. So that then gives you size error. It gives you something that gives you an index of their scalar accuracy. And here's what we find. On this axis here is the size error. 0 means perfectly accurate circle. Anything above is a bigger circle. Anything below is a smaller circle. This is their BIT score, so that dashed line is the cutoff. Anyone on this side of the dashed line doesn't have neglect. And on this side, the further you go in this direction, the more severe someone's inattentional symptoms. And what we see here is that the more severe someone's neglect, the more they shrink their circles down. So the circle isn't fine. Actually, something's happening here. And it may very well be that if you draw a tiny circle from the outset, then trying to accurately put all of those numbers and hands in is just going to be terrible. With the same patients, we asked them to start their drawings from a specific point around the circumference. As I said earlier, making any of these kind of judgments is a demand. Putting your pen on the page is a demand. You might do it systematically, but it's still a thing. If we take that demand away, then we might find that people are a little better. Maybe if we ask them specifically to start in their neglected field, they might get a bit better. You can cue people out of their neglect symptoms, so maybe that's going to help. So they did the same scintillating task again, but with the starting point specified. What we found was there's no difference between getting people to start on the left or the right. So they still shrink the more severe your neglect, and they still shrink in both axes. People were more accurate when they were drawing from their preferred starting point rather than some weird place you've made them draw, which makes an awful lot of sense. But what we found was that the patients with neglects were producing those circles in an unusual way. So if you are drawing a circle and you are forced to start from a certain starting point, the direction of rotation is going to change accordingly. More often than not, if you start somewhere, it's sort of a division line around about here. But if you draw a circle starting at this point around its circumference, you will go anti-clockwise around it. If you start drawing a circle from a point around here, you'll tend to go clockwise. Sorry, I got those two mixed up, that's terrible. But everyone with neglect constantly drew their circles in a clockwise direction, irrespective of where they were starting. So even if they did a perfectly good circle, they started from where you told them to do. Their direction of rotation was atypical. Gosh, I've really overrun here. I'm so sorry. So I'm going to speed this up in a way that hopefully still maintains some kind of sense. Qualitative appraisal is proved incorrect if you ruin everyone's fun, and it tells you more about neglect. But the key point here is don't make assumptions about what people are doing, and actually you can get interesting knowledge that you wouldn't otherwise have if you look at these things more carefully. Patients with constructional apraxia have difficulty planning and performing those kind of drawing movements, not because they have a movement problem, but because it's very hard to reproduce spatial relations. So in this study, we wondered whether the nature of those spatial errors might be modulated by what they're drawing. So if something groups strongly to form a whole, they might be less likely to make these errors of placement than something that doesn't necessarily support thinking of it as a good structure, as it were. So we looked at that in these two right hemisphere patients. You don't need to know any of that. So this is what we did. We designed a drawing task. Again, something simple in the top, space below. Your job is to copy it. And we had these stimuli, so little L-shaped things that group nicely to form a shape that you all recognise. And then in other conditions, those are skewed to make, in Gestalt terms, a less good form. So no longer do these kind of stimuli support a good Gestalt, a square. They now seem to be more likely to be different elements in their own right. Both of those patients could fully discriminate all of the stimulus set, so we double-checked that they could see that all these things were different. Patient ECR tended to complete across a lot of the gaps. So she could see that there were 4 elements here, but her drawing was one that was very much oriented towards their Gestalt, the square. RA, in contrast, had all of the corners perfectly well drawn, but they did not nicely form a square. Lots of numbers and some measurements as well. So crucially, each of those vertices in all of those stimuli is 6 by 6 centimetres in shape. That means if you spend a lot of time with a ruler and protractors, you can get all of the scalar qualities of everything they've drawn and look at how these things have been produced. And we see that RA is much worse than ECR in terms of the internal angular error, and the height-width deviation is not very square. But there's no difference between these patients when you begin to skew the figures. So in effect, there's something about when things strongly group that suddenly you get these dissociating impairments from these patients. One patient seems to be drawn to the whole to the detriment of the parts. The other patient seems to be drawn to the parts to the detriment of the whole. We'll leave that there. Now, that might sound like an esoteric question that lives in a very esoteric part of neuropsychology, let alone anything else. However, it's very strangely reminiscent of a whole theoretical debate in autism research. And that debate stems from the fact that although autism is still primarily diagnosed on the basis of social differences, there are a whole host of interesting effects in the visuospatial domain that have given rise to a whole raft of other theories about the condition. And that is associated with the fact that a lot of tasks show people with autism to produce at a level that is superior to typically developing counterparts. So things like pattern discrimination, block design, and so on. So people with autism are more likely to spot where that triangle is in this. I've shown you where it is in this design. If you move the part, if you put gaps between the blocks in the pattern, that helps typical people to do that better in block design, but actually people with autism are just as good at both types. So the argument is that there is a strength in autism, a perceptual strength, and that has 2 competing theories for its origin. One theory is the weak central coherence theory. That suggests that there's a bias towards the local level. It's a cognitive bias, but it means that people are more likely to focus on the details in comparison to the overall thing. And mostly that's visuospatial, but sometimes that can be evidence in not understanding the gist of what someone's saying, not reading between the lines, focusing on the content of a phrase, that kind of thing. But the argument is it's a somewhat global deficit in favour of a local strength. In contrast, the enhanced perceptual functioning theory is very much couched in there being a local strength that has a neural basis. It's not a cognitive theory, it's about low-level processing. There's no difference in global performance, and there's superiority at the local level. Now, in truth, if you know anything about these things, these theories are so big but so flexible that they'll account for absolutely every finding you could throw at them. So they're not nice things to test because they'll seem to accept all comers. That said, they do have some ramifications for how someone with autism might treat parts and wholes in a drawing, especially if you ask them to draw lots of funny little corners that may or may not make a square. So these findings are equivocal in autism. Sometimes you get these observations of strength, sometimes you find no difference between groups whatsoever. But there are demonstrations of people with autism drawing in a manner that is reminiscent of constructional apraxia. So I showed you this figure earlier from someone with constructional apraxia. These figures are from people with autism drawing. Here's someone drawing a house, and they've, instead of starting, like in the Ray figure, with a large outline and then sort of putting parts within it, they've started with a window and then a door joins it and so on. But here's also someone with autism drawing a house, and that looks not too dissimilar to what you might imagine someone with constructional apraxia producing. They've got all the parts there, but they're not in the right kind of spatial relationship. So there are predictions that those theories come up with for thinking about how we might produce those things. So we looked at that. We've got two groups of children. Children with autism, typically developing children. They're matched on verbal ability, non-verbal ability, and so on. We gave the poor things, the same things that we give them patients, so lots of corners that make up squares. I lost weeks of my life measuring them all. We also spent a lot of time looking at the local level as well, so the quality of each of those little corners too, because that's going to be key here. The weak central coherence theory predicts that those manipulations of grouping, making things more or less square, will be less likely to affect the kids with autism than the typical kids. So if you are biased away from the gestalt, it doesn't matter what I do, your drawings are going to be just as good. However, the enhanced perceptual functioning prediction says that there's going to be superiority at the local level for the kids with autism. This is one slide to just show you basically there's no difference between these groups whatsoever. So at the local level and at the global level, they're exactly the same as the typical kids. So neither of these theories can cope with what you actually see. And this also comes from measuring drawings properly rather than looking at a couple of things going, oh, look, they're fine. Oh, look how different they are. So I'll leave that there. So the final thing I'm going to end on, and I'll hit an hour, I'm sorry, it's just a final point about typicality. Like, what do we believe to be the baseline? How good should we expect people to be at certain things? So the mocker, for example, we look at someone's clock and we have an assumption about how that clock should appear. And then we see things like this, and we make some assumptions about that, what that might mean. So here's a clock that looks perfectly good, except for the fact that we've been asked to draw it at 10 past 11, and it's not at 10 past 11. So the hands have been swapped. Here is a clock that begins with 1 and goes all the way around, finishes at 11. It's just missing what should be at the top. Here's something that appears to be a stab at 24 hours and then kind of got abandoned. These are all from undergraduate students. So we were running a study that was apropos of something completely unrelated, looking at like large-scale search abilities in VR, seeing how different components of their foraging abilities might distinguish older adults from younger adults. So basically it just meant that my PhD student, who was running all of these experiments to validate the method before then doing this neuroimaging study and using VR and using older adults, she had lots and lots and lots and lots of clocks. Well, it was basically administering the mocker to the undergrads as well as the older people later on. And so we've got 160 odd undergraduates producing clocks, and we begin to see things like this. So there are 165 youngsters, and then later on we were testing 53 older adults. A third, pretty much, of the youngsters failed to meet cut-off on the mocker. And only 2/3 of those people were able to accurately draw a clock. So that might say something about the recruitment criteria, but I think you all know where we're going with this. Things are changing, aren't they? And if you look at the three different, this is just scored up according to mocker criteria. If we look at where people are going wrong, or where the youngsters are going wrong, it's the hands. It's actually knowing how to tell the time using clocks. So That's telling us something. I mean, we did lots of other things too. We measured all of those clocks, and actually the youngsters were producing significantly smaller clocks than the older adults. There's no difference between the two groups on the basis of how correct they are at each of these different layers. So it didn't appear to necessarily have any knock-on effects. But we really shouldn't be expecting these youngsters to be indistinguishable from older adults. Especially when that older adult cohort went all the way up to 93. There was someone in there that we purposefully tested. They had Alzheimer's, and we were just really keen to see if we could use VR with someone with Alzheimer's, and she was really keen and all that kind of thing. But she shouldn't be doing better than our undergrads, I would contend. So it's been recently shown in this kind of adventitious study, kind of stopping people in a supermarket car park and asking them to draw clocks, that younger people are less good at telling the time with analog clocks. Because, I mean, I've always had a digital watch. I'm a middle-aged man, and I've always had that. It takes me a moment to look at that thing, and if it's used as a device in a film to show me how much time has elapsed, I kind of miss. I just assume some time has elapsed. But I can still tell the time. I can still do it. But, you know, people are so used probably to focusing on this and thinking about time a little differently. And this shows the ramifications for a cognitive screen, doesn't it? A cognitive screen. That, in effect, people are scoring much worse than they should because the lion's share of the mocker score goes to the, you get 3 points for the clock, don't you, compared to other things. Copy a cube or do trail making, you only get 1. So they are most often failing on hand placements. That suggests a lack of familiarity. But more importantly, I guess we have to think about the long-term validity of these things. What do we think people should be able to do? At what point are we going to have to chuck away this really useful thing that has lots of parts, everyone should know what it means, and we're going to score it up according to certain criteria. But if those criteria aren't really going to cut the mustard anymore, then we're going to have to think about this. And before long, we might have all these terrible type 1 errors where someone's been screened for something completely innocuous, and then you suddenly think they've got mild cognitive impairment. It needs to be addressed. So at the very least, it seems to be more effortful for young, well-educated individuals than at least it was designed to be. All right, so that was all a bit long-winded. I'm sorry, I hope it made sense. All I want you to come away from this is thinking that it's not just wonky clocks. Like, you can get these really rich types of information out of drawing errors. They tell you an awful lot about human information processing. It's not a window into someone's perceptual experience. If I ask you all to draw a bike, they'd probably almost all be shocking. That doesn't mean you don't know what a bike is. It doesn't mean you have any difficulties, but there are some, you can't assume that a drawing accurately reflects someone's knowledge. So you have to treat these things very carefully. You have to decide what you want to use a drawing for, what you want to get from it. But I'd argue that we need to kind of continue to think about this. We need to think about these things more carefully. We can design tasks that give us more control, that give us numbers, give us things we can do things with. That might allow us to dissociate disorders that we would previously put together, but actually they're really rather different if you look at things more carefully. We can ensure that the errors we do see aren't confounded by other things, whether we're confounding them or whether drawing a tiny circle actually is the first problem. And if you care about these things, it allows us to move towards more comprehensive cognitive theories, cognitive models about how the mind works. And they don't have to live in one domain. It's amazing how similar the fields of visuospatial neuropsychology and autism research are, even though they're studied by completely different people, following completely different traditions. Like, they are reinventing the wheel in some places and not drawing from what we know in other domains. So you can take these things and plonk them elsewhere. Equally, there's an awful lot of commonality where you least expect it. And as ever, in an age of increasingly sophisticated things and expensive things, and we're all scrabbling around for money to do anything, the very fact that we can get rich, beautiful, inspiring things from a pen and paper, and indeed discover something about human thought and the potential for impairment in there, that we otherwise wouldn't be able to get, I think is really exciting. And that's the end. If you want to read more about this, there is a chapter in that book that talks about these kind of things. But like, please buy it. No one's buying it. so if at least one person might want to look at it, that would be really good. But I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I'm sure you have some questions. I mean, I've got a couple of questions, so I don't know if I can start. So I guess one of the things that's going through my mind is how useful you think something like the MOCA is. We rely really heavily in clinical practice on the MOCA, particularly in the world of stroke and also in neurosurgery as a screening tool. And it's part of our guidelines to use it as a screening tool, and it's sort of meant to help us decide whether somebody would need further testing or not. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on that in terms of usefulness of things like the MOCA?
I mean, we thought about some of these things at the MS Trust conference, didn't we?
Sure.
It really depends on what you're after. If you've got 5 minutes and a filing cabinet drawer of these things and nothing else to do, then it's better than nothing. But I think understanding what you're getting from it and being able to take all of that with a pinch of salt is really important. I think for some things it's always going to be very helpful, isn't it? In as much as, I was talking to a colleague about this, are we interested in specific areas of impairment, or are we interested in the kind of landscape of difficulty and where there's sort of peaks and troughs? So that's where the difficulty comes out. Like a poor score might be a whole section that's terrible, which would suggest specificity, if you like. This is the top one, it's the visuospatial bit. Or you've got sort of pock marks of difficulty, and then you can interpret that in a variety of different ways. So it's really tough. I think because I've spent a lot of time thinking about neuropsychological tests, it's always going to be about, if you actually care about any of these things, you have to dig deeper. But then you're stuck with, I have the privilege of being a scientist rather than, it's not a privilege, but in as much as I'm allowed to devise my own tests whenever I want and actually look at the pattern of performance and then say, this appears to be the thing, I'm now going to just quickly make up these things and do that instead. But we don't always have the opportunity to do such things. So
yeah, and I mean, as an occupational therapist, I'm always frustrated by the sort of recommendations to use something like a MOCA to be as always the screen, whereas I kind of would think, you know, if I got someone to put a cardigan on, I might get more information out of that in terms of a screen. Yeah. But the testing hasn't been done on the putting of a cardigan on.
And it's also about what you're after. Like, you're interested in whether someone can live their life in an appropriate way. Or, you know, it has good quality of life, can be independent, all these kind of things. And my focus is on, like, intriguing, pointless subdivisions between these different... so that's the other thing. It's like, what is one trying to get from it? And you're absolutely right that sometimes if you completely focus on dryness and abstraction, you're actually missing all of the things that you need to know in order to understand where to place someone and where to consider the support they'll need.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? If there's none, I've got another question. But
There's a back. There's a back.
Mine actually is a related question. So if, and this could definitely happen, if you were to remake the MOCA, the Smith version of the MOCA.
Soccer.
Exactly. What would your, what picture would you have for people if you would? Like, what would you get people to draw? Like, what do you think would be an ideal? Would it be the clock and just take away?
Yeah, I've been thinking, you've asked exactly the question I've been asking myself since I started putting these slides together, because that is the beauty of the clock. The whole point of the clock is that it's supposed to transcend culture and education and all of these things that we might imagine to be progenitors of difference and or a lack of validity or sensitivity in our testing. So the clock is actually supposed to be the thing that should get us out of that quagmire, and it's not. But I'm having an awful lot of difficulty trying to think of something that should be culturally independent of education, and yet still have... The good thing about the clock is we know what it's supposed to look like, and you can... Sometimes people do funny things, don't they? They'll draw a grandfather clock, or I've got one in my office on my desk where someone's written Gucci and has tried to do all these other designs. But we know exactly what it's supposed to be, and there are so few things you can say that for. If I ask you to draw a 20-pence piece, like, people are really bad at drawing them. If you don't know the system, people more often than not have the Queen facing the wrong way and don't realise that Charles should be facing the other way, and which ways those are. So something you could hold in your hand every day, you don't have. It's the same with the bicycle that I was talking about earlier. So actually trying to think of something that has such a prototype that it will withstand any difference is remarkably hard. So I don't know whether the clock was just happened upon and then we've realised how useful it was, or whether the clock came about through trying to identify something that had parts, had hands to set, it has a gestalt, it has parts that need to live in this very specific place, and then you have to do something with it that demonstrates your understanding. And yeah, I've been racking my brains, and I just cannot think of an alternative. So yeah, I really don't know, and obviously I would be overjoyed to have any discussion with anyone that cared about these things to actually start thinking it through.
There's two questions.
I think you were first. That's all right. Go for it. You were first.
Hi, my name is Nicole. I'm one of the occupational therapists here as well. Similar, I guess, question around the clock and how kind of how valid it is really in this day and age where we all look at phones. Do you feel like our human ability to actually use a pen and write is changing as well? Because the example I had today is I was asked to sign 5 leaving cards, and I thought, oh my goodness, this is the first time I've actually picked up a pen and written something all day. And I just wonder if, like, we are becoming more digitally minded, and so our way, potentially in the future, our way of assessing visual spatial abilities might not be through using our hands and drawing. It might be more through kind of technical means. I'm just thinking of like apps you might use to assess it instead, because I just felt like really in the moment, like, oh my goodness, I'm not even picking up a pen, and even writing, never mind actually drawing anything, is not something I do on a regular basis anymore.
Indeed. And like, we think about this a lot with our students. There's one can have an assumption that if you're a digital native, you know more about computing, that you're going to be less baffled by some new stats package because you've always had the internet, and that's not the case either, because the front end is getting so much nicer, so much easier to deal with, and so proddable that you don't. So even suggesting that people do things with a keyboard is probably inappropriate now, because. So yeah, it's really interesting. I think I would like to think that there's still a lot to be said for prodding with your finger, and to a certain degree that's not too dissimilar to prodding with a stylus. It's not writing, it's performing an action. It's an action that leaves a mark. A lot of what we do know about drawing came from Dutchmen with graphics tablets in the mid to late 80s, and they were interested in literally the control of single line elements. So like changes in velocity as you go around a curve. So you slow down the more curvy it gets, the 2/3 power law and things like that. And at that point, it almost looked like maybe we don't want pen and paper anymore. We want graphics tablets for patients that are actually going to be getting dynamic motoric output as well as anything. But again, that's not the same as the glory and the simplicity of a bit of paper and pen. So I would like to think that there's something still in there that should transcend these changes, because it's not writing, it's drawing. They are different. They're not the same thing. There's this beautiful work showing this. I used to work with this chap called Norman Freeman, and he ran this study using a graphics tablet, actually. He had this stimulus that was a kind of boat with a couple of letters at either end. And you were either required to put the portholes in, to draw the two circular portholes, or if it was B and K, you were asked to put the O's in book. And the kinematics were completely different for the circles and for the O's. So drawing isn't writing. You can get primary writing tremor when people are required to write a word and will have the tremor, but if they're required to do a drawing, they won't have the tremor. So they're separate systems. So I like to think that there's still something in tapping this thing that's separate to other things. There's another question, of course, about whether there's something important about the friction, that if you're using your finger, or if you start using digital pencils on slippery surfaces, that you're not necessarily getting the same things and people feel less control and blah, blah, blah. But again, that's a boring conversation for another time. But I'd like to think that there's something still in there about making a mark that is kind of transcends all the difficulties we're now having with, I mean, just poor students writing for 2 hours in a sports hall. Like, if we're having difficulty writing Christmas cards, then imagine what duress they're under.
We've got a question here.
Yeah, hi. So my name's Lawson and I'm a clinical psychologist in the Islington and Haringey community neuro rehab teams. And I guess I've got kind of lots of questions, and thanks so much for the interesting talk. It's definitely got me thinking about the role of drawing tasks in neuropsych assessment. I guess this is kind of circling back to, I guess, the role of kind of culture now, because I guess I'm making assumptions, but we're really used to such a broad range of cultures in the kind of populations that we serve that might be potentially quite different to the recruitment sample you might have in Plymouth. And I'm aware that over the past couple of years, there have been some really exciting developments whereby alternative tests that are very similar to the clock drawing task have been developed for kind of for other people from other cultures, so like the pizza and poppadom tests. And I guess I was just really curious to think a little bit about your research and whether that the kind of culture was something that you kind of controlled for as a variable, but also potentially whether you are aware of any similar findings that have been replicated in research into kind of cross-cultural drawing testing.
Yeah, that's a really great question, because this stuff it's not even that it's agnostic, it just ignores all of that. The assumption, the naive assumption I've always had with this research is that it's simple geometric forms that don't come with anything. And that wasn't intentional. That wasn't actually me thinking I need to make this thing free from potential for difference or bias in terms of what we expect from performance. But actually just thinking, a lot of the time if you ask someone to draw something, especially in a clinical setting, people can have a response to that might be, I'm not very good at doing this thing. So what I was really keen on was trying to completely dissociate it from experience or training or confidence or anything like that. So if it's a triangle, it's just a triangle. But that is on my part a huge assumption in itself, that we should expect everyone to be equally confident just drawing a triangle. So I really don't know. I'm intrigued to hear about these alternatives, because thinking about alternatives to clocks, actually, I guess the pizza's halfway there. It doesn't quite have the same notion of function that the utility of the clock is. It was in the hands that we were seeing the difficulties that the youngsters were having. But it'd be nice to learn more about that. But yeah, it has not been taking these kind of things into account, and that's a really important thing to think about.
Thank you.
Any final questions? No?
There's one right at the back.
Oh, one right at the back, and actually one down at the front. And then once we've done these, I think we'll break for wine.
Hello, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. I just have some questions related to the MOCA. I'm a physiotherapist and I've been working on clinical trial, and we've been using the MOCA to screen cognition in chronic stroke patients. And there has been two things where I've been thinking. I haven't read about it, so I'm just asking, like, I could just like kind of like search it, but maybe you know it. So for example, in patients where their kinetic side is their dominant one, and then they have to draw with their non-dominant one, how do you account for changes in drawing? Because obviously they're going to be worse. Like,
Mhm.
is that cognitive? Is that just lack of ability? What is it, you know?
Yeah, we're running a study on that right now. With a colleague at Mount Gould Hospital, so they've just got loads and loads of data on people performing tasks with their dominant and their non-dominant hand, which is ultimately the issue, isn't it? And I think it is a question of whether, so using your non-dominant hand is not only going to be less accurate, but it's going to be more effortful. So the question then is, does that tax more than just sort of action production, if you like? Is it because there are so many effects where you can impair the system, if you like, by simply requiring people to do something with their non-dominant hand. We've also even found with kids, sorry, my brain's going off in odd places. I think about search tasks. We ran all these studies where kids were looking around for these hidden things in the floor by pressing all these buttons. And we'd ask them to either search with their dominant or their non-dominant hand. And that would have all of these effects on their memory for where they had previously checked. So just searching with your non-dominant hand has repercussions for spatial memory. So I don't know the answer, but I think it's not just about, you're right that it would be less accurate, because we would all produce, the more strongly lateralized we are, almost by definition, the less accurate we'll be with our non-dominant hand. But also, if that is also associated with cognitive load that is over and above the thing you're trying to test with that item, then there's a whole other issue there too. So yeah, we are actually looking at that right now.
So do you think at the moment is as valid to use the visuospatial kind of like part of the mock-up, someone who has drawn everything with their dominant hand in comparison to someone who has drawn everything with their non-dominant hand? Like, do you think this data is comparable, or do you think it should be kind of like...
It all boils down to the scoring, doesn't it? Like, if you're going to score it according to the criteria that you've been required to use for a given test, then you are likely to, so that Necker cube, the wire cube, that's quite strict in some respects, isn't it? If the proportion's a bit off or anything like that, then tough, you've failed. So I think it's not going to be valid, full stop. But that said, if one were able to use one's own criteria, then you can begin to work around that kind of thing. You can have a system where the score would be systematically treated numerically in a certain way, and there are adjustments. I'm not that familiar with the mock about that. You can make adjustments for education and things like that with the score, can't you? So there might be adjustments one can make that will kind of reaffirm its validity. But I think in truth, some of these tasks are not appropriate to use in that way, and they shouldn't be buffeted around by the dominant hand that someone's using, and we need alternatives.
Do I have time to ask a very fast last question, or should we... Yeah? Okay, so about the cube again, I'm just talking about asking about the mock-up because it's the one that I'm using. But with the cube one, do you think, because I feel like we all know how to draw a cube. Like, we were all very bad at drawing the cube until somebody tells you the trick about drawing a cube, and then we all get super good at drawing it, right? So I feel like it's a little bit tricky when we try to, observe how good they are at drawing something that's 3D, that has different types of components, when it's something that we have been exposed that much to drawing. But like, for example, other types of mock-ups where you have to draw a bed, for example, that's a little bit more complex. So is there anything that says, it's us, it's the things that you can actually extract from the drawing a cube is actually the same as what you can extract from drawing a bed, which is such, being such different kind of like drawing.
Yeah, well, in effect, it's a copying task, isn't it? So the aim with the cube is to see how well someone can presumably perceive the cube reproduce the cube, monitor their drawing for error, that kind of thing. A problem with the cube, as I said earlier, is that it's got these kind of oblique lines in. That cube is also used in psychology as a kind of bistable, almost like visual illusion. So you don't know which of those faces is at the front, and it can flip around. So in some respects, it's a terrible choice compared to, say, the overlapping pentagons, which shouldn't have the same trick that you might have been taught or may not have been taught to produce. But then at the same time, there's something about that 3D projection that can really knock people off. And maybe that's useful. Maybe there needs to be some little precipice there for someone to be teetering on for it to be considered useful. But again, it's just scored 1 point. And what is one after? Are we looking for something that is going to be conservative or liberal in terms of its ability to identify potential difficulty? So yeah, I don't like it, but then it's like how much are you going to squeeze into this thing and all of that kind of thing. But I'd prefer the pentagons to the cube because of exactly the absence of a trick. If you ask people to draw a house, they'll draw it in a certain way. If you, again, Peter Van Summers did this lovely thing, a similar figure, which was like a semicircle with a line and a base and a little circle inside and a thing. And if he said, draw the man with the telescope, they'd draw the head first, they'd draw the little circle and then the line and then the big semicircle and then the telescope and then the feet or whatever. But if he said, draw the cocktail, they'd draw the big semicircle first and the stem and then the base of the glass and then they'd draw the little cherry with the stick coming out of it. So the semantic label you give what is, to all intents and purposes, an abstract figure will completely change how people approach it. We need to we either want to be purposefully interested in that or we definitely don't want that. So it depends on what we're after. Sorry, that was a long response.
I think we're going to finish up there because we've got time for further questions in the foyer and there is wine awaiting. So it's just left to me to thank you very much, Alastair, for coming all this way and for giving us such an interesting talk, which is, I think, fueled lots of questions in our own minds about what we're doing in clinical practice. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.